I didn't lose my gravel pit. The man next door lost almost everything because he couldn't bring himself to admit one simple truth. If it isn't yours, you don't get to take it. Looking back now, the strangest part wasn't the theft itself. It was how completely convinced he was that I should just smile and let it happen because we happened to share a property line. My name is Ethan Walker, and I own about 230 acres outside the little farming community of Red Hollow, Missouri. My grandparents bought the place after the Korean War with money they scraped together one paycheck at a time. My father spent 40 years adding fences, digging ponds, fixing barns, and when the farm became mine, I kept doing what our family had always done. Work hard, stay out of trouble, and never borrow tomorrow's peace just to win today's argument. The farm paid the bills through cattle and hay, but tucked behind a ridge covered in oak trees sat something a little different. A natural gravel deposit left behind by an old river thousands of years ago. It wasn't glamorous. Nobody drove across 3 counties just to admire a gravel pit. But contractors loved it because the rock was clean, properly graded, and close enough to several county roads that hauling costs stayed low. I'd leased the excavation rights to the same local contractor for nearly 16 years, and every load was documented, weighed, invoiced, and reported. It wasn't the kind of business that made headlines, but it quietly paid property taxes, repaired fences, and helped put both of my daughters through college without loans. I liked that kind of income. Predictable, honest, boring. Boring is underrated once you've owned land long enough. Things stayed that way until the property east of mine sold one spring. The old Johnson place had been empty for years after Harold Johnson passed away, and honestly, I expected another rancher to buy it. Instead, a man named Brandon Cole showed up, driving a brand new black Range Rover that looked completely out of place on our dusty gravel road. He stepped out wearing polished boots that had obviously never touched manure, expensive sunglasses, and one of those watches people wear so everyone notices they're wearing one. He introduced himself with a confident smile that felt practiced. "Investment property," he said while looking across the hills instead of looking at me. "This whole area is about to grow." I nodded because people from cities are always convinced they've discovered something country folks somehow missed. He asked about the trucks he had seen driving through my back pasture every few days, and I explained the gravel lease. He seemed interested, maybe a little too interested. "So that's worth decent money?" he asked. I shrugged. "Enough to keep the lights on." He smiled again, thanked me for the information, climbed back into the SUV, and disappeared in a cloud of dust. I remember thinking he seemed harmless. Maybe a little full of himself, but harmless. Funny how often we're wrong about first impressions. About 6 weeks later, I was repairing a water line behind my equipment shed when my lease operator, Dave Morrison, called. Dave wasn't the type to waste anyone's time. "You working the pit on Saturdays now?" he asked. "No," I answered. "Why?" There was a short pause before he said, "Because I drove by yesterday evening, and there were at least 4 dump trucks loading gravel. Figured maybe you found another contractor." My stomach tightened before I even reached the truck. I drove straight across the pasture toward the pit, and the farther I went the worse the feeling became. Fresh tire tracks crisscrossed the access road. Deep loader marks cut through the bank where the excavator usually worked. Someone hadn't just wandered in, they'd spent hours digging. I parked, climbed down, and just stood there listening to the wind, because sometimes silence tells you exactly what happened. After years of looking at that pit almost every day, I knew every slope and every shelf. There was an entire section missing. Back at my office, I checked the hauling logs, scale tickets, invoices, text messages, nothing. No scheduled pickups. No emergency orders. No paperwork at all. I estimated somewhere around 220 tons had disappeared. It wasn't enough to ruin me financially, but that wasn't really the point. Somebody had walked onto my land, taken what belonged to me, and apparently slept just fine afterward. There was only one person who suddenly had a major construction project going next door, so I called Brandon. He answered on the second ring, sounding relaxed, almost cheerful. "Hey Ethan, what's going on?" I didn't bother with small talk. "Did your crews remove gravel from my pit?" There wasn't even a moment of hesitation. "Yeah," he said casually. "We needed base material for the entrance road. I figured it wasn't a big deal. I'll square up with you once financing closes." For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd heard him correctly. "You figured?" I asked. "You never asked permission." He laughed softly like I was making life harder than necessary. "Come on, we're neighbors. It's just gravel. I looked out my office window toward the fields my grandfather once plowed with an old tractor that barely started in winter, and I thought about every lesson he'd ever taught me. Respect another man's fence. Respect another man's tools. Respect another man's land. The value of the item never mattered nearly as much as respecting ownership. No, I finally said. It's not just gravel. It's inventory. You owe me for every ton you took, and you owe me now. His friendly tone disappeared almost instantly. Don't make this into something stupid, he snapped. I'm good for it. Then paying today shouldn't be a problem. He hung up without another word. I sat there staring at my phone longer than I'd like to admit, not because I was angry anymore, but because I suddenly realized this wasn't about money at all. Brandon genuinely believed success gave him permission to rewrite other people's boundaries whenever it suited him. And people who think that way almost never stop after the first time. The next morning, I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity, because once you've owned land long enough, you learn there's a difference between someone making an honest mistake and someone testing how much they'll get away with. I called my attorney, Daniel Harper, a quiet man who had spent nearly 3 decades handling property disputes across southern Missouri. Daniel wasn't flashy, and he rarely raised his voice, but I'd watched him dismantle complicated cases with nothing more than patience and paperwork. After I explained everything, he interrupted me with one question. Did he admit he took the gravel? Word for word, I answered. He said he figured I wouldn't mind. Daniel was silent for a couple of seconds before saying, "Good. Don't call him again. Save every message, every estimate, every invoice, and let's make this official." That afternoon, we filed a police report. Deputy Ryan Foster met me at the pit, walked the haul roads with me, photographed the fresh cuts, measured the excavation depth, compared it against my lease records, then asked if I knew where the gravel had gone. I simply pointed toward Brandon's property. We drove over together. His crews were grading a wide entrance road leading toward a future commercial development. And there it was, my gravel spread across hundreds of feet of freshly packed roadway. Foster knelt down, picked up a handful, looked back toward my property, and quietly smiled. They didn't exactly hide it. Brandon came walking over wearing the same confident grin I'd seen the day we met. "Morning, Deputy. What's going on?" Foster asked him directly if he had removed material from my property. Brandon folded his arms and answered without the slightest concern. "Sure did. I already told Ethan I'd pay him after the project closes." Foster looked at him for several seconds before saying something Brandon clearly wasn't expecting. "That's not how ownership works." The confidence disappeared just enough for me to notice. The deputy explained that taking property without permission wasn't delayed payment. It was theft. Brandon tried to laugh it off. "Seriously? Over gravel?" Foster replied. "No, sir. Over someone else's property." Before leaving, the deputy issued a citation and told Brandon detectives would be forwarding the case to the prosecutor because of the estimated value. Brandon stared at me as though I had personally betrayed him. As soon as the patrol truck disappeared down the road, he marched over. "You actually called the police?" he barked. "You actually stole from me," I answered. "We're even." He shook his head in disbelief. "You've got no idea how business works." I smiled for the first time that day. Apparently not your kind. 2 days later, his attorney contacted Daniel with what he called a reasonable settlement. $500. That was his offer for material worth several thousand that had already been used, compacted, and could never be returned. Daniel didn't even bother hiding his amusement. "Tell your client," he said over speakerphone while I sat in his office, "that the opportunity for cheap solutions expired when he drove onto my client's land without permission." Instead of negotiating, we filed a civil lawsuit for conversion, trespass, damages, attorney fees, and any additional losses related to securing the property. Once the paperwork was filed, I decided I'd had enough of trusting basic decency. I hired a local fencing company to install a heavy steel gate at the entrance road leading to the gravel pit. We poured concrete around the posts, installed commercial locks, mounted high-definition cameras on treated poles, added motion sensors, infrared lighting, and cloud recording that backed up every second off-site. My wife, Linda, watched the installers work while handing out iced tea on a 95-degree afternoon. "Seems like overkill," she said quietly. I looked toward Brandon's property where bulldozers were still moving dirt. "Maybe," I answered. "Or maybe this is cheaper than trusting the wrong neighbor." She didn't argue because after 31 years of marriage, she knew that tone in my voice. It wasn't anger anymore. It was caution. About 2 weeks passed without incident. Harvest season kept me busy enough that I almost convinced myself Brandon had finally understood the situation. Then at exactly 2:07 on a Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected. Gravel pit camera 3. At first I assumed it was a deer. We get dozens wandering through the property every week. Still half asleep, I opened the live feed and immediately sat upright. Bright headlights filled the screen. A white dump truck carrying the logo of Coal Development Services sat directly in front of my locked gate. 2 men climbed out carrying bolt cutters. I watched one of them cut through the chain while the other waved a flashlight toward the pit. My heart wasn't racing because I was surprised. Oddly enough, it was racing because everything had suddenly become very simple. I called 911 before my boots even hit the floor. "They're back," I told dispatch. "They're stealing gravel again." Linda met me in the hallway. "Don't go alone," she said. "The deputy's already on the way," I assured her, grabbing my truck keys. "I'm just keeping eyes on them." By the time I reached the ridge overlooking the pit, the first truck was already loaded. An excavator was digging steadily under portable work lights while another truck waited its turn. I stayed back where they couldn't see me and kept dispatch updated. Less than 10 minutes later, blue lights appeared over the hill. Deputy Foster arrived first, followed almost immediately by another patrol unit. The workers froze. One driver actually tried backing away before realizing the exit was blocked by the patrol cars. Foster stepped out calmly, looked at the broken lock lying in the dirt, then at the truck's half full of fresh gravel. "Evening, gentlemen," he called. "Having a productive night?" Nobody answered. One worker quietly pointed toward his phone. "Our boss told us we had permission." Foster nodded. "Then let's call your boss." 20 minutes later, Brandon pulled into the pit wearing jeans and an expensive quarter-zip sweater, looking more irritated than worried. That changed the moment he saw 2 deputies, 3 patrol cars, and my camera pointed directly at the broken gate. "This is ridiculous," he said before anyone asked a question. "We've always had access." Foster tilted his head slightly. "Really?" He pointed toward the destroyed chain. "Then why cut the lock?" Brandon looked at the ground for a second before answering. "I assumed Ethan changed it by mistake." Even one of the deputies had trouble hiding a smile. Foster folded his notebook closed. "Mr. Cole, you've already been charged once for taking material from this location. You're currently being sued over ownership of this gravel. There is a locked gate, surveillance cameras, posted no trespassing signs, and you chose to arrive after 2 o'clock in the morning with bolt cutters." He paused just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. "Help me understand which part of that sounds like permission." Brandon opened his mouth, but nothing came out. One of his employees quietly whispered, "Boss." But there wasn't anything left to say. Foster placed him under arrest for felony theft, criminal trespass, and destruction of private property related to the damaged security gate. As Brandon was escorted toward the patrol vehicle, he looked back at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You're destroying my business over gravel," he shouted across the pit. I answered as calmly as I could. "No, you're destroying your business because you couldn't stop taking what wasn't yours." Word travels unbelievably fast in small towns. By breakfast the next morning, everyone at the feed store knew Brandon had been arrested again. Some people shook their heads. Others laughed. A few couldn't believe anyone with that much money would risk everything over something so small. But people who worked the land understood exactly what bothered me. It wasn't the gravel. It was the assumption that ownership only mattered when it belonged to someone important. Daniel filed an emergency motion for a permanent injunction before noon, attaching still photographs from every security camera, timestamps, police reports, and sworn statements from the responding deputies. Looking through that stack of evidence, even I had to admit it told a story no jury would struggle to understand. Brandon hadn't stumbled into a misunderstanding. He had driven straight through every warning sign imaginable, convinced the rules simply didn't apply to him. And now every mile of that road led directly into a courtroom. By the time we walked into the courthouse a few weeks later, I wasn't carrying any anger with me anymore. I was carrying folders, photographs, invoices, excavation records, survey maps, security camera footage, police reports, repair bills, and every document Daniel had spent years teaching me never to throw away. People think lawsuits are won by dramatic speeches, but most of the time they're won because one person keeps better records than the other. Judge Eleanor Brooks didn't waste much time listening to excuses. She watched the surveillance footage from beginning to end without interrupting once. The courtroom stayed almost completely silent as Brandon's employees cut through my lock, drove into the pit, and loaded truck after truck under floodlights. When the video ended, she slowly removed her glasses and looked toward Brandon. His attorney argued that his client believed there had once been an informal understanding between neighbors and that the second incident was simply the result of poor communication between employees. Judge Brooks leaned forward just enough to make everyone in the room pay attention. Poor communication does not explain bolt cutters, she said. Nor does it explain arriving after 2 o'clock in the morning while active litigation over the same property is already pending. Brandon finally stood and tried speaking for himself. He insisted he always intended to pay. He claimed the construction schedule had created pressure, financing had been delayed, and everyone was making too much out of what he called a simple disagreement between neighbors. The judge stopped him before he could continue. "Mr. Cole," she said calmly, "this court has heard many property disputes. This is not one of them. Property disputes involve uncertainty over ownership. You knew exactly who owned the gravel. You simply decided permission was optional." You could almost feel the air leave the room. A few minutes later, she granted the permanent injunction exactly as Daniel had requested. Brandon was prohibited from entering any portion of my property for any reason, ordered to compensate me for the stolen material, reimburse the cost of replacing the damaged gate and security equipment, cover my attorney's fees, and pay additional punitive damages because his second theft demonstrated deliberate and repeated misconduct. Brandon's attorney asked the court to reduce the award, arguing that the financial burden would be severe. Judge Brooks answered with a sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The least expensive decision available to your client was paying for the gravel before taking it. That was the end of the civil case, but it wasn't the end of Brandon's problems. A few weeks later, Daniel called and asked me to stop by his office because he had found something interesting while reviewing public records connected to Brandon's development company. Brandon had already listed his neighboring property for sale, advertising it as having valuable aggregate resources and future gravel extraction opportunities that significantly increased its market value. The problem was simple: he didn't own those rights. Every meaningful gravel deposit sat entirely on my side of the surveyed boundary, and there had never been a recorded easement, lease, or mineral agreement giving him access. In other words, the listing was selling buyers a benefit that legally did not exist. Daniel reported the matter to the appropriate licensing authorities along with copies of the survey, deed history, and court findings. The listing was immediately suspended while investigators reviewed the advertising claims. Brandon was eventually fined, forced to correct every marketing statement, and spent months explaining to potential buyers why the property no longer matched the promises made in the original sales package. By then, his legal bills had grown far beyond anything he ever expected. Between criminal defense attorneys, civil litigation, engineering consultants, surveyors, permit delays, court costs, fines, and the judgment itself, the money disappeared much faster than the gravel ever had. About a year later, he called me personally for the first time since the arrests. His voice sounded completely different from the man I'd met beside that shiny Range Rover. The confidence was gone. "Ethan," he said quietly, "let's end this. I'll pay everything I owe if you'll sign an access agreement so future owners can purchase gravel from your pit." I looked out the kitchen window toward the same hills my grandfather once walked, thought about the broken lock lying in the dirt, the late-night phone call, the deputies standing beneath those floodlights, and every opportunity he'd been given to simply do the right thing. "No," I answered. "Business works best when it starts with trust, and you spent that a long time ago." He didn't argue. He just sighed, wished me luck, and hung up. 2 years after all of this started, Brandon finally sold the property for substantially less than he'd paid. Local real estate agents later told me the combination of court records, delayed development, legal history, and damaged reputation had scared away more than one serious buyer before someone eventually made a discounted offer. Looking back now, people sometimes ask me if the fight was really worth it. After all, the original gravel wasn't worth millions of dollars. Maybe it would have been easier to accept the money later and move on. I always give the same answer. If I'd allowed that first load to slide because it seemed easier, there would have been a second, then a third. And eventually the lesson everyone around me would have learned was that my boundaries were negotiable. They weren't. They never were. Owning land isn't just about acreage. It's about responsibility, stewardship, and respecting the work that came before you. My grandfather used to tell me that every fence has two jobs, keeping things in and reminding people where they need permission to cross. He was right. Brandon didn't lose nearly $90,000 because of gravel. He lost it because every time someone offered him one last chance to make things right, he convinced himself he was smarter than the consequences waiting around the corner. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted his promise to pay later and avoided the legal battle, or would you have handled it exactly the same way I did? Let me know down in the comments because these situations always split people right down the middle. And if you enjoy true style stories about property disputes, legal victories, difficult neighbors, and ordinary people standing their ground without crossing the line themselves, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes respecting other people's property is still one of the simplest signs of good character.